welcome to episode 168 of The Route. The Route is a glorified coffee chat and podcast form that takes you from A to B with a new guest every episode. As always, I'm your host, Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. Before we begin, a couple things to cover. First, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast, follow the podcast, rate 5 stars, like the podcast, whatever you want to do. I needed you to do it right now before we begin. Just allows the podcast to grow just a little bit easier. You can find us on all major platforms. I believe we're on 10 or 11 audio platforms. That's some of the big ones: Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, and probably some other ones as well that I'm not as familiar with. But then we're also on YouTube. And all those you can find us with the Route Podcast or at the Route Cast. And then with that as well, as I mentioned, YouTube, you can watch us there with the video podcast. There's also clips every day from that week's episode to kind of get maybe a little bit of insight in regards to what that podcast is about, what kind of things we're discussing, and you can listen to it in a little bit more detail in the full episode. And then same thing with our social media platforms. There's clips coming out every day. The day the podcast comes out, we have a magazine cover type of thing where you can kind of look into that episode, that guest, and see if you want to connect with them. And that's on our social platforms at the Routecast: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all that good stuff there. But most importantly, for what we're discussing here today, LinkedIn. So with LinkedIn, a little bit different than some other podcasts. You can connect with myself, you can connect with the guest, you can connect with other like-minded people to grow, expand, or even just start your network. So check us out there at the Routecast, all platforms. With that, I'm going to be done talking now, and we can get into today's guest. Today's guest is brought to you by Pickled. Pickled is a new social and sport option coming to those in the Ottawa area. If you're interested in learning more, sign up for their newsletter using the link in the episode description to stay up to date. With that, today's guest. I'd now like to welcome someone who has a ton of experience in the communications world, in various industry sectors, with years of experience in intriguing roles on and off of voluntary basis in the different types of things they've done to date, with now being the Director of Marketing, Communications, and Community Outreach at Beechwood Cemetery and Beechwood Cemetery Foundation. Nick McCarthy, welcome to The Route. How's it going?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on The Route. It's going great.
Yeah, no, amazing. As I mentioned there, you've been able to do so many different cool roles and also just roles from a voluntary basis. So as the name states, The Route, let's kind of go through that. Take us through your route. Where did you begin? How do you get to where we are today?
So being an Ottawa native, right? So it's like born and raised in Ottawa. You kind of, I went to Ottawa U. I studied history, French literature, and philosophy, right? So those were really my passions. And I really understood the link between, you can't study French literature without understanding French history. You can't study philosophy without understanding with that. But being an Ottawa native, you're kind of preconditioned to think about the government being the first thing you go into. So in high school, university, I worked in grocery stores, and I loved it. Right, you got to talk to people, you got to connect. After university, I quickly went to one of those job hiring places, like a job firm, and they got me my first contract, and it was with Measurement Canada. And Measurement Canada is an Industry of Canada special operating agency that looks at weights and measures, right? Most people don't realize, but it's really what we're all doing at the cash register, at the scale when you're buying bananas to gas pumps. And so that was my first real entry into the government. They brought me in as an unexperienced executive assistant. And from there, I quickly transitioned to an information officer, communications officer within about a month and a half. So what was interesting about that and was really different about communications and Measurement Canada, there was an article that had come out in 2008 about the volumetric rates with gas pumps, either shorting Canadians. So a lot of my job at that point transitioned from being an assistant to actually dealing with some of the media outlets, strategy, looking at data, looking at how to transform that data. So I did that for a year and a half. It was one of those contracts right out of university. And what was neat is within about a month and a half, they gave me a year contract with the organization. A lot of learning and a lot of really adaptive learning at that point. After that contract, I went to Health Canada as an information officer, and that was with the Canada Vigilance Program. And the Canada Vigilance Program, again, it's an enforcement style program for pharmacies to look at negative reactions when it came to drugs, pharmaceuticals. And so I was able to do that for about 3 months. Again, short term contract, a lot of social media aspect, a lot of, again, information. A lot of my career has dealt with information, how to evaluate that and communicate it out. From there, I got my first full time job in government. I actually refer to it as the first time I received my golden handcuffs. And that was with Competition Bureau. And Competition Bureau, of course, it was like at the back end of the Hull Government of Canada, 1970 towers. Really, really exciting place to be because they were looking at how different groups and different organizations and businesses were treating Canadians. The idea of like the big grocery store chains, the telecoms, and looking at how competition between them worked and if there was anything untowards. But as I said, it really felt like golden handcuffs. We were looking at data, looking at information, really helping build cases in that case. After that, I went to a private research firm as a research analyst. And this was like my first big jump, right? I'm like, okay, government, I wasn't too keen on it. I always refer to it as golden handcuffs. But I went to a research firm, so like a public opinion research firm. And I was there for a few months. It was during early part of my marriage, so I was working long hours. Wasn't really something that I could see myself doing long term. But I ended up working there for 3 months. And then the Treasury Board of Secretariat came calling. And to me, I was still undecided if my career was going to be in government. And I got a full-time position again. Those golden handcuffs came back, and I became a communications officer there. And I was there for 2 years, 11 months. And at that point, I really got one of my first mentors. And I think this is something that I can trace throughout my career, these wonderful mentors. And she really taught me about government and what I could do, what I couldn't do, and if it was the right place for me. And so I was there for, as I said, almost 3 years. And it's typical millennial. Like I'm a 40, and so I'm typical millennial, right? Every couple of years, you got to jump, you got to change, you got to do something different. It was neat. I got to do a little public opinion research there. Got to do a lot of, again, analysis. Everywhere I went, there was a lot of analysis, a lot of communications. It was during the strategic operation review as well, which was kind of hard to do because you'd see people sort of lose their jobs around you, and you'd have to sort of deal with that. And the idea of government being eternal, government employing being eternal, really sort of disappeared for me. And then it was also the beginning of like open data, open government, a lot of social media outreach. And at the time, it rubbed me the wrong way because it was more of a one-sided dialogue. And it was a very, very different than what I came accustomed to through actual social media and actual outreach. So I got an interview with this not-for-profit association. And this is like my first entry into not-for-profit. I was like, okay, let's do something neat. And it's with the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists. And so, of course, I didn't know what an occupational therapist was. So I did my research, read up on it. And I was there for almost just over 2.5 years. And it was such a different environment. And it's something that really changed my mind on government. It cemented that my government was not a good fit, but it also cemented that you could do a lot more outside of government. We ended up lobbying, like it was the first time I got to lobby Parliament. It was the first time I presented to a cabinet committee. It was the first time, a veterans committee. It was the first time I got to, really travel through work. We'd organize conferences, do social media campaigns with international organizations. So it was really a fun place. And what I really took from COT, or the Canadian Association of Auction, is knowledge translation, right? So like we all work communications, we all talk, we all try to share narratives. But if you can't communicate it effectively to an individual, if you can't communicate it to a person, and they understand it at a fundamental level, then you're not doing your job. So we published really simple papers, and uh, we had a magazine that I was able to write in on a regular basis, and so it really got me up and going in everything that I do now. I credit it for a lot of things. So we had this great office at Carleton campus. It was part of that, very involved with that sort of research base. You had that hub, that energy, and then we moved to a new facility, and the entire vibe changed. It was sort of different. Yeah, I ended up not enjoying the last sort of 4 or 5 months, and it was one of the places where I was let go. But I was let go um, as a communications officer, and then finding out they were hiring a director after. So obviously, I had done something right, but um, I think had I not been let go, I wouldn't have moved on. So from that sort of like shock and awe, let's say, of being terminated, I ended up applying to my first labor union. So my family background, my father has been in labor for 47 years, I think, as a federal at the federal level. So I joined the Association of Justice Council, and so this was a federal labor union. It still is, of lawyers, Crown Counsel, prosecutors, really interesting work. But you can imagine trying to be a communications director to lawyers. There was a lot of like, why'd you put this comma here? Not a lot of creative aspects, right? We were looking to do it. We also had a president change at the time, and we went from somebody who believed to keeping the membership very much informed to somebody who wanted to reduce the communications from the union to just the bare bones, so they have a good understanding. Again, that was a place where it was the first time I got that title, and your other guests has probably alluded to it, but in Ottawa, once you get that director of comms title, it completely opens doors. It can really change the directory of your career. I enjoyed it, and I thought it was different. It was during the beginning of the Phoenix program too, so we had a lot of fights in that sense. They hired me because of course, I had a bit of lobbying background. I had a bit of knowledge translation, healthcare. They were looking at mental health issues too within their membership. So really, really fun organization to be with. But it kind of got tedious. It was sort of rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. You write the same document over and over again. You same email, same everything. So I started looking for opportunities, and like where I am now, I would have never thought. Like you asked me if I started in university, would I be at a cemetery? I would have said no. I had one really good friend who loved the bereavement industry. She's been in it since she was like 16 years old. Couldn't talk better about it. And like beautiful example of somebody who knows what it is about. But so I come in, and I wasn't sure. I saw the job posting on LinkedIn, and they called me in um, January, February of 2017, and they never had a comms director before. They never had a communicator on staff. They always relied on outside things, but they had a few events. They did some history stuff. They did a bit of marketing, but it was very old school marketing, right? Like almost product marketing, pre internet, let's say. And so I came in, and the interview was scheduled for 15 minutes. Me and my retired president, because he retired, I hate to say past, because in my industry, the minute you say the past president, they think he's passed. But he's retired now, happily retired, I should say. And we ended up talking for an hour and a half. And it was one of these conversations where he was sitting back, and he's like, wow, you learned so much about my organization. And I told him what I thought he was doing wrong, what I thought was too complicated, how it wasn't connecting, how do you have this place that's 160 acres, 150 years old almost, and nobody knows about it in the heart of Ottawa? And I kept sort of reiterating that, how important it was to sort of turn Beechwood into the Arlington of the North, or the Arlington of Canada, or really make Beechwood its own thing. And so it was 3 other interviews, and we had that. He kind of let it slip because I asked him about conversion rates and stuff like that for phone calls and on the internet. And he's like, "Well, we don't do conversions on the website because we don't really have a website." Again, this is 2017, and he's like, "Well, you're gonna have to figure that out." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. I guess I've got the job." Final meeting, of course, was the terrible, like, how much money do you want to get paid? And as a millennial, I hate talking about money, right? I think it's just a byproduct of of who we are. And so I'm like, well, here's the minimum. And he was like, all right, we can definitely do more than that. And so I got hired for sort of what I thought was fair. And it was really had to prove myself, because you can imagine a place that's at that time was 144 years old, and it's the first director of communications and marketing. And I was going up against a lot of, well, we've always done it this way. We've always done it this way. We've always done. So it was a really interesting place, because I got to sort of get that really fun taste of the for-profit world, the private sector world, which I loved, which is sort of going out there and promoting the business, promoting what we do, trying to make sure that everyone sees it and sliced bread. But it's also the not-for-profit, because we're a foundation that actually owns the for-profit company. So the idea that you're always thinking about how you can reinvest, but you can take your time and you can do events that are focused more on community. You can do. We have a magazine we publish 4 times a year. We have a historical program. We have a reconciling history program. We've got a green program. So it was really sort of the culmination of almost 10 years of my career into a single place, where it's like there's some knowledge translation. How can you explain death and dying to healthy people? And it's not scary. And it's not, how do you teach about the aspects of something that normally people are only confronted with in the worst day of their life? So that was really different to think about. And Beechwood's opened up a whole bunch of opportunities. I ended up being chair of the Tulip Festival for a year. I ended up joining No Stone Left Alone, which is an Edmonton or Alberta-based organization that's branched out nationally, where we get school children place poppies on military graves. I helped create a Latin American Soldiers Committee. I'm not Latin American either, but I've been adopted by the community, and it's just such a wonderful way to connect, right? And these are identifying soldiers in World War I, World War II, right? That came and paid their own way, and their only experience with our country was basic training and then fighting overseas with a maple leaf on their shoulder. So really interesting stories. I worked with Wreaths Across Canada for almost 3 years, becoming their vice president, and then finally sort of saying I've got to do other things. And then the latest organization, the volunteer organization I'm with, is the Global Famine Way. We're the Irish Ottawa Bytown Committee, and it's about identifying burial sites of famine Irish, the victims of the potato famine. So again, that's more within my background and culture. And so I've been able to use Beechwood and do that. And so it's always within that same realm of military, community, culture, heritage. And had you asked me like 20 years ago, I thought I'd go back into school, go back and become a professor, teacher of history, right? That's my passion. But I've been able to find not only hard communications, hard marketing here, very traditional, but then also feed that wonderful history side, that always wanting to learn. One of our trade magazines even has me. I have a monthly article that I submit about the history of the bereavement sector, and it's whatever topic I want. And I've talked about everything from why we drape a flag over a casket to Shane McGowan's funeral from January this year, to just the simple traditions we have, like the use of sand at burial services, or um, why. Why we bring stones to cemeteries, or why you'll see that often at Jewish cemetery, bowls of stone. So Beechwood has provided me this unbelievable opportunity, and the events that I've also gotten to perform to plan here are as varied as the community we serve. And just within the last month, we've had a Scottish event. We welcomed the two prime ministers, both Trudeau and Attal from France, for an event here. We're having an event with 4 different embassies in about a week and a half, 2 weeks from now, to having a Somali history night, where there's this wonderful museum in our city, and it's 4 members of the community who decided that it's time to sort of teach the culture, teach the history. And it was such an interesting night because it's something that we're not exposed to. And I think that's what I've been able to do here, and what I've been able to really accomplish is being exposed to a lot of different communities, but also exposing a lot of different communities to other groups. Like we even held this thing called the Death Cafe, which is a whole bunch of people in a room eating cake, talking about dying and death, and having a meaningful conversation about something we're never supposed to talk about. So it's been, again, it's been this weird career, and even my position here is relatively unique within the bereavement sector. There's only a few of us that I know of across the world, and we've been able to connect and sort of talk and stuff. But it's been a fun time, I'll say.
Yeah, no. And I appreciate you sharing everything to date so far. And I think you've done a great job going through your route, which will make it maybe a bit easier for me to kind of share certain points I
Yeah,
wanted to dive into a bit further. Obviously, we won't cover everything because we can't do that in regards to covering, 10 to 15 to 20 years of people's
yeah,
careers in a short amount of time. But I do have quite a bit of things I want to get into. So we'll kind of go back to the beginning and we'll try to fill
yeah.
in some gaps to where we are now. The first type of question I usually like to maybe refer back to or ask something around this is just you're talking about, you Ottawa, right? You went there, you're an undergrad student, you're kind of just maybe figuring things out. And then, you went into your first role. And I always like asking about that because it seems like things always kind of change or it's not always what people expect for the most part with that first role. Did you have any maybe um, original thoughts of where you would go for a first role, or did that role in the government kind of just come about and you're like, yeah, I'll take it. It's a full time job. Let's see where it
Well, I went
goes.
to a placement agency, right? So my first government job was a placement
Oh yes,
agency,
yeah.
and you do those aptitude tests and stuff. And like I knew I wasn't going to be a good admin assistant. Like I'm terrible at taking meeting minutes. I'm terrible at stuff like that. I'm too opinionated, for my own good. But the role quickly transformed, and I think it was one of those things that I sort of like pushed back a little, and I was like, okay, maybe like I can do this for you, but like let me also do this. I'd like to try to do that. And you have those conversations with like the director of communications, and you're like, well, can I try to support you on this? Write some lines, give you some statistics, do some other work. And I think that was really what kind of helped me realize that communications, and specific media communications, social communications, was what I wanted. But the role itself, it was a role that, you're out of university, you're like, okay, I need to try something new. I need to not do that the job I was doing in university. Like I'm forever grateful to having worked in a grocery store. You got to learn people, right? I'm a firm believer that you can tell everything you need about a person by them buying bananas. Um, and it's true, and it's always led me right. But it was that idea that it was a stepping stone, and it made me realize what I wanted, what I didn't want, and how I wanted to see what I could be. Did I think I'd become a director by the age of 30? No. Or 31, I think was my first directorship. So it was sort of interesting in that sense. I was able to move quickly.
Um, two questions that kind of come from that. I buy green bananas. What does that
You're a
mean about
planner,
me?
right? So it's like you have the people who want that instant gratification.
Oh yeah,
They'll buy them ripe and then they'll have to go back, right? The green, yeah, it's just something you
yeah, yeah.
noticed, and you got to. I worked there. It was in my neighborhood, so you got to know the people pretty well, and you just understood, right? And you got to know them. You're like, okay,
Hmm. Would it throw that whole thing off if I said I like to eat the
yeah,
bananas a little
that's
green?
yeah. Let's pass by that because I think that's a whole different
That's
conversation,
okay.
Vince.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah. Anyway, so but the question that I had originally about the recruitment agency is when you went to them, was it something that you're just kind of open, like, hey, like I remember when you're looking for your first job, you kind of had something in mind, but at the same time, you're a student, you want some money. Were you
It
open to
was
different types of roles, or was it really kind of
it was
communications
it was.
in
You
the
have no
government?
experience. We need to get you experience. You have no office experience.
Okay.
And it's like, so it was just like I met with Measure Canada. I kind of liked the idea. I like that they were doing good, right? I think that's throughout my career. There's a few opportunities I've had that it didn't jive with my personal values, And it could have been a lot of money quickly, but it also meant doing something that I wasn't doing, communications for an organization that I didn't 100% believe in. And I think that's been a trademark through my career. There's certain times where I'm like, it's time to leave.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess going back to maybe some themes of your career, right? Obviously, we're both here in Ottawa, and like you mentioned and touched on a few times, working in the government's kind of a big piece that a lot of people either have experience in or they know someone within. And you kind of said there's almost, let's say, a juggling act of going in. Should I stay out? Should I go back in? How did you kind of maybe work through that? Because I'm sure a lot of people, if they're in Ottawa and they're listening, they maybe had that same type of thought process. Just kind of curious what it was
So
like for
I
you.
refer to golden handcuffs, right? And it's the idea. So once you're in government, everyone in Ottawa, especially, everyone's like, "Oh, it's a career for life. It's a job for life," and so it's almost like you're handcuffed to it, right? And you have no choice. Once you get in, you get in. And I'm not slagging the government; they do incredible work. I know a lot of people. My wife's in the government; she does incredible work, loves it. But for me, it wasn't. It wasn't right. And my last time at government, I was with Treasury Board, and I was hired from private sector communications. I was hired by a manager who was looking to mentor me. She's like, "Okay, I'll get you in through the door here, and then we'll get you," because I had been doing speech writing, I'd been presenting, I had been doing a whole bunch of different things that weren't traditional to a junior role. But with the government and the inability to move up quickly, she's like, "I'll get you in the door, and then we'll get you to where you need to be," because of course there was a speech writing component to Treasury Board. And she left quickly, and then I had a terrible, terrible director who, in my opinion, was one of those jumpers, right? Um, there's a lot of, it's like the lily pad directors. It's like you're jumping from one lily pad to the other to get up. And she was very much that stereotypical boss. So anything you did was her work. You would produce reports, remove like your name would be removed from them, and so like there's a big distinction between like a boss and a mentor. But in that organization, there's this woman, and she's passed now, Kathy Lads. She was a public opinion research, came from very much a similar background, but she was in government for about 30 years. And just a mentor who got me to go to that interview to the not for profit. And she's like, "What do you have to lose?" And she's like, and then when I came back and I spoke to her about it, and she's like, "You're not happy here. You're not that you're this is not where I think you're going to be useful in life, where you're going to feel valued." And it sort of hit me, and it's that concept of being valued that was very important. Like, how can I give something back? How can I do something, do good? And like, not to say the Treasury Board doesn't do good, but it was very different. So she really gave me that one push into the not for profit world, and from that, it was something that I believed in. It was something that I found meaning in what I was doing.
Yeah, and I think that point you mentioned there of those golden handcuffs is definitely that a lot of people deal with, right? Where I actually worked in the government when I was a student, and for context, my parents, they're both from Portugal, so my grandparents are very much the Portuguese immigrants. I got that job in the government considering they were in
Yeah.
cleaning and construction. They called it like the lottery, right? My grandma was ecstatic. You're in the government, you're set. Like you're good to go, Chris. You're there, you're gonna make good money. I'm so happy for you. And then when I started saying, "Hey, like I don't want to do accounting or I don't want to be in the government anymore. Like this isn't for me." They're like, "What's wrong with you? Like what are you doing? Like you can't do that." And then they kind of suggested one day, "Hey, Chris, when you graduate, we want to give you a full-time role." Quit the next day cuz I'm like, "This isn't for me." So, what was that process of maybe leaving the government, that conversation with your mentor, or was it like a slow burn where a bunch of different things kind of piled up and you're like, "You know what?
I'll,
Let's take
I'll say
that jump."
both. It was a slow burn. There's a few things that I didn't agree with. Like we were, um, there's a few directions that I really didn't agree with, and it was internally. It wasn't political, because the government I was working as a public servant for was not a government that I voted for. And people can look at my LinkedIn and figure it out from there. But there's just a few things that really rubbed me the wrong way, and it was just the direction of what people were doing and stuff. How the government is using social media in a non outreach way, in a non communicated. Like it's meant to be dialogue, it's meant to be open. The the swift from open government to open data really bothered me. So the government went in and they were talking about how everything was going to be accessible, and then quickly the word government disappeared and became open data instead. And it was data sets that were already available through either ATIP or other things. And there's some public opinion research stuff that happened as well that really didn't do it for me. So the idea of that golden handcuff, like you're told, oh no, you're in the government, stay, don't worry, things will get better, things will change. And I'm like, can I do this for 30 years and feel like I've accomplished something that I value? And then was I valued? And it's like my director at the time, like I said, I'd write reports and like my name would get deleted from it. I'd provide information and it would just disappear. It was I was really unhappy being that cog in the machine, right? Where you're just doing the same thing over and over again. So for me, the idea of a golden handcuff was it terrified me.
Yeah, and funny enough, I don't know how the podcast always ends up going through, maybe just from the format, but the thing you just touched on there is exactly what I was going through next, just in regards to that one-sided dialogue, right? So when I was in the government, I was in accounting initially, but I realized, hey, I want to go more down,
Yeah.
let's say the marketing type of field. And then I was like, oh, maybe I could just reposition myself within the government. And I was looking at it, I'm like, hey, like for what I want to do and how I want to learn things, I don't think this would make sense. So with that, actually, funny enough, the guest that was right before you on episode 167 of the route, they actually worked for the Blue Jays for 15 years
Yeah.
in PR. And one of the things they were touching on was how when they, got terminated from the Blue Jays and they were trying to maybe reinvent themselves or kind of start their career and kind of continue it on, they found they were almost having a hard time, getting those new roles because people only viewed them as a sports communications person, where they're essentially just managing groups of media rather than actually, maybe doing it from a different lens that you would do in maybe tech or, commercial, anything else from there. Did you ever have any of those um, issues when kind of leaving the government because kind of go it from one perspective, or it's maybe a little more one sided, to now maybe taking it at it from a different angle?
That's interesting. I think I think the biggest difference for me was not for profit to labor communications, actually. Because I wasn't seasoned enough when I left government to not for profit. Um, that I think that I didn't experience that, but going from not for profit, forward communications, presenting, lobbying, stuff like that, to labor communications, which is very much steeped in law, right? It's very much steeped in labor laws, and you have to be careful what you say. Very, very different. I think that was a big learning curve for me. And again, I went from having a mentor at my not for profit to not having a mentor. And I think the mentorship aspect is important, especially when you're going through your career and learning. And I kind of alluded to it before, but learning the difference between a boss and a mentor. Not all bosses are mentors. Not all mentors are bosses. And sometimes somebody who's at the same level or in a different group might be a better mentor than the boss. So I think the learning curve between not for profit and labor was big.
Yeah, and I think too, just as you went on with sharing a route, one of the big takeaways that I kind of saw was, I think you mentioned learning how to effectively communicate, right? And I think that was then maybe a big theme as well throughout your career. How did that come about? Because I think as you're sharing your route, it wasn't necessarily something that you learned in that first role, right? I think you mentioned it about halfway through when you're going through your journey. What was the real change and what was the learnings that you kind of took away from that?
Well, so knowledge translation, right, is huge, and I think it's when I was in public opinion in non in private sector, the idea was sort of how can you communicate the findings so that people can understand them, right? And like using surveys and stuff, and how can you take that data and help decision makers make the decisions that they need, right? And evaluate communications. And there's a few times where it's I remember we met with a client and they had a slick video and it was great, and then at the end of the meeting we're like, okay, so there's nothing for us to do, right? Like everything's good, like we're good, like the problem's solved. And they're like, well, how'd you take away from that? I'm like, well, you pretty much said the problem's solved at the end of that video, so why do you need us? And so that was these learning periods where you can't be afraid to tell somebody like, okay, your back end of that comms project is wrong because it's too finite. But it's also the translation. So with like the occupational therapist, I kept sort of getting back to like, they kept going, like, no, you have to look at the studies, the research. I'm like, well, if I don't know what an occupational therapist is, how am I supposed to ask for one? If I don't know what they do? And I remember sort of having these back and forth with these highly accomplished academics, right? Like really, like literally, their name was on the textbook. Like that's how accomplished they are. They were the textbook. And I remember saying, well, if I can't, my mother or my father or my cousin can't explain why they need you, then what's the point? And it was great because one of my mentors there, she was a lobbyist, and she really sort of pushed that idea as well. So you had two people from two different perspectives saying that we have to take the research and we have to make it into something that's bite size. How can it help my child? How can it help my mother? How can it help me after a car accident? And how can it be different from something else?
Yeah, no, no. I guess just to build on that, is that maybe from like taking it at the angle of how would the end user, like what do you need to say for the end user to understand it? Is that kind of what you're getting at there? Where like how can you speak to the end user where if you're just, pitching that data, like okay, great,
Well,
like what does that mean? But then if you're actually speaking from
it's
someone
how
that
can
can
you make the
understand.
person,
Sorry,
what's
go
the
ahead.
call to action, right? How can you make the person realize, ask for it, right? And ask to have these services or ask to have this information, or come in and ask about a pre-planning funeral, right? If you don't know if you don't have the right information, you can't make the right decision. And I think the idea of sort of knowledge translation really comes from me studying history, right? You can have a whole bunch of information and you have a whole bunch of different sources, and you have to explain the core element and you have to explain what happened. And I always found communications in history kind of go hand in hand. And for me, I think that's the field, that's the idea of where it's like you can take a lot of information and dwindle it down to 1 or 2 points, because we're only realistically able to walk away with 2 3 things. And I hope, like, after this podcast, you hope that people take 3 points, right? And it's like, okay, it's like you have to make the journey what it is, I guess. And I think that's where it was important, and distilling it down to what we need the person to advocate for themselves and what we need that person to do. And if we can get that person to do what we need them to do, then we're good from a lobbying perspective, we're good from a funding perspective, we're good from a membership perspective, fundraising. So
And would you say having learned that is what made you ready to then become a director of communications? Because I know you said that was maybe a big jump, and once you have that title, then it opens a lot of doors. But maybe once you kind of had that aha moment of, hey, like this is how you effectively communicate, I'm ready to take on maybe a
yeah,
larger
I think
challenge.
definitely. I think the transition from the labor union to Beechwood is really representative of that, where I had enough history and enough background and enough years behind me to know that I could move forward, right, and be effective. Like, I still say to my boss, the minute I'm not effective, you can let me go. And I think that's key. It's the idea is that you want to make sure that you're always moving forward in a meaningful way and you're always learning more. I'm constantly still reading white papers. I'm constantly looking at the different communications institutes because I want to stay up to date. Like right now, everyone's talking about AI, and I've been thinking about AI, using AI on a personal level and on a semi-professional level. So it's all these ways. How can we move forward, and how can we understand and not be afraid to make mistakes, but also not be afraid to make big decisions, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people are fearful of, and big decisions being big decisions in ad buys and marketing ideas and events, but also jumping, right? Like leaving the government was a huge decision that, like, people said I regretted. When I left the labor union, they said they at the exit interview, like, you're going to regret this. And that was, oh yeah, and it was just interesting, right? And so that concept of that challenge and those big decisions, you can't be afraid of.
Yeah. I think even just the point you're mentioning there about AI,
Yeah.
not to get into an AI discussion, my fiance was saying only men like AI yesterday. But on that point, it's almost like not being afraid of those innovations, but learning how they can, positively, impact your role, right? And perfect example is this podcast. It takes so much time to edit, but then the clips now with
Yeah.
this platform I'm using, it generates the clips in about 5 seconds. I edit them a tad, and I can get 10 clips out in 30 minutes, right? But it makes that process a lot easier. So just
Yeah,
being
I
open
think.
to that too. And then I guess one
Oh, I
of
was
the
going to say,
things.
I
Go
think
ahead.
AI is just inductive. It's just the next tool, right? And I think it's not being afraid to do the next thing
Mhm.
and potentially fail at the next thing or do great.
Yeah, exactly. It's just another tool, but just learning how to maybe use it
Yeah.
effectively where, you don't need to do everything. And I think some things are too much, right? Where I don't think you should always be communicating with AI. I have people at work where they're saying they're using Chat GPT to come up with emails and stuff. I was like, hey, like maybe have a
Yeah.
personal touch to it. Well, there are some things where it can speed up your process. Um, I think just going back to making that switch into the director title and maybe getting into now Beechwood as well. I'm curious about how that role kind of came about because for the most part, the podcast, I would say about 50% of our audience is millennials, right? Late 20s to about 40 years old, right? The people that are kind of in the midst of their careers, or maybe they're about to make that first larger change, or maybe
Yeah.
they're trying to make that jump to maybe a higher position now. How did that come about? Was it your network? Was it just being open to interviewing and seeking out new
I
roles?
think it
How did
was
that
being
kind of come
open
about?
to seeking out new roles. Like when I interviewed for the labor union, I was very honest about my political backgrounds. I was very honest. And I think people are afraid to be genuine during interviews, right? They kind of want to tell you who they want to present their best place forward. And for some reason, I've never been like that. I want you to hire me for me, right? And the labor union was they really hired me for me. I had my political background. I knew I was a lobbyist. I knew how to get on the hill. I knew so they definitely hired me for that expertise. And they did take a risk, and I remember them saying like, "This is a risk. Like, you're relatively new compared to other comms directors in the labor field in Canada, especially at the federal level. It's supposed to be your top of your top. You're like older labor guy, labor communicators." But they took a chance, and then it's Beechwood. Like my wife still makes fun of me, and she's like, "Oh, you took a job at a sleepy cemetery, but last year I had 120 events, right?" So I think we have to sort of not be afraid to take those risks, right? And not be afraid to make the job what you want. I could have come to Beechwood. I could have done it as essentially what I think they wanted. But would I have been happy? Would I have been satisfied? Probably not. And would they have been satisfied? And would I have been able to give back to my company the way I did? And it's funny from when I started in 2017 to now. A lot of the staff members, a lot of the team that I work with, they used to have to explain what Beechwood was, and now when they're talking to people they've just met, they're like, "Oh yeah," and they bring up either an event or they bring up the military or they bring up like our tulips, or what have you, right? They bring up an aspect as if they know. And I think what I did with Beechwood, I wasn't afraid to fail, and I wasn't afraid to try new things. And you can imagine, right? Like a 150-year-old business, and you're coming in as this like 33-year-old communicator who's like social media and let's like do persona marketing, let's do communication, community marketing, let's do really look at how to drive traffic and how to do this with people who internally and externally who are very much doing the same traditional thing, like, oh well, this is how we've always done it because that's what worked in the industry, and an industry that's as old as the second death on the planet, right? um, to do things that are new and exciting and different, and to bring in movies and to bring in runs and to um, bring in chalk events. There's a risk that people might be angry, but there's also a risk that the community might understand and the community might want to jump on board. And we've been able to sort of do that a lot of the times. And I'm really proud of what we've accomplished. And you have different the military views it, we're like we're their home. The Lebanese community in Ottawa, we're their home. The Chinese, we're their home. The Ukrainians, we're their home. So it's like what I love. It's like you meet people when you're going around town, and they're like, "Oh no, that's my cemetery," and it doesn't matter what background they're from, right? And it's like, "Oh yeah, that's my cemetery," and it gives you that opportunity. And then meeting new people. And it's like I was at the Army Ball, and I met the new ambassador from Iceland, let's say, right, and he's like, "Oh, it's in my backyard." I'm like, "Well, you've got your people here too." And he kind of looked at me stunned that there was people from Iceland buried in the National Cemetery of Canada, but there were, and we're still working on dates to come and sort of do something together to celebrate that history. So I think don't be afraid to make the job what you want it to be. I think that's what the directorship taught me, and not be afraid to push back, and not be afraid to trust your gut and know you're right. And it sounds arrogant, and I don't mean it to sound arrogant, but just to do, like sometimes you can trust your gut and take that risk. And as long as you communicate effectively within the team that this might be a problem, this might be a risk, but we're going to try it, then you're good.
Yeah, and to be honest, like I think you've done like a perfect job of just kind of sharing how that all kind of came about, how it makes sense, and I think someone listening to it can absolutely almost visualize whether they're just listening on Spotify how that all came to be. And before we wrap up the podcast, I have three questions I want to ask. One more about your route specifically, and then two to kind of just close it out how I like to at the end. Just being in Ottawa, the Tulip Festival is pretty big, and you kind of touched on that quickly earlier. I went for a run yesterday. I'm seeing the tulips out, and then I see here that you were the chair of the Tulip Festival. I'd like to maybe just hear about that time period a bit further because I know that's something you kind of graced over, and then we can kind of wrap up the podcast and go on from there because I think you've done a great job
Yeah, I
to
think
sharing
there
that.
is a few opportunities like the Tulip Festival or Wreaths Across Canada. I think they're good opportunities. They're these organization of people who want to honor and celebrate specific moments in Canadian history, right? And I'll say I'll put Tulip Festival, Wreaths Across Canada, and No Stone all under the same umbrella because they're organizations that I joined that were pre-existing, right? And what made them interesting is you got to meet people who really cared about their community, and you got to look at it as if it's how can you get back, how can you can go on and do good, right? And sort of when I was at the Tulip Festival, I kind of saw that extension, right? So you started in May with remembering the sacrifice of May 8th, so Victory Europe Day, the liberation of the Netherlands. And then you go into the week before Remembrance Day with No Stone. And the idea of bringing kids and bringing younger students to understand what that sacrifice is and to be part of that. And then Race Across Canada was to bring in the family members of the soldiers who have passed and lay a wreath at their headstone so that nobody was unhonored towards that month, right? That really important family month, be it whatever religion you're part of. But December really is a holiday month. It's Christmas for me, but it's a lot of things for a lot of other people. And just having that opportunity, I think it was every aspect to help me grow. Everything was very different. Um, but I take a lot from that time and understand what I wanted, what I didn't. And then when I moved on to be a founder of two other organizations with partners, it really sort of taught me on who I wanted as my team, what the direction we wanted to go. So our Latin American Soldiers Committee were three, my two counterparts are Latin American, so I'm the token white guy on the committee, but it's really allowed us to sort of build that structure, figure out how we want to do it. The Irish committee was the same idea, right? Who do we want? We want we want the ambassador. We want some historians. I was sort of brought on because I have an expertise in certain things, and you want to fill these executive volunteer roles with what you need, right? And I think that's what Tulip Festival, Wreaths Across Canada, No Stone really sort of informed me. No Stone became a great mentorship. The two, well, the four people that are part of that, part of the foundation, just incredible people, right?
No, I appreciate you sharing that. And I guess before we end the podcast, I have two questions I'd like to ask. And we're going to put your historian hat on here, where I've been saying for 100, I guess 68 episodes now, I'm going to live till I'm
Yeah.
103. So I'm going to put you in the same position. You're going to live until 103. You're going to be on a rocking chair just thinking back and forth about all the cool things you've done in your career to date so far. What's maybe one story that when you're 103 on that rocking chair, you're absolutely going to remember and be like, wow, I can't believe I got to do that for work at one point in time?
I know exactly what it is. So with the Dutch embassy, or sorry, the embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but we call it the Dutch embassy, right? So Princess Marguerite during World War II, she was here, right? She was birthed here. Ottawa essentially declared a zone, part of the General Hospital, Dutch soil, so she could be born on Dutch soil, right? During the pandemic, we had planned to prior to the pandemic happening, we had planned to have her come to Beechwood and unveil a plaque. And at Beechwood, there's the soldier who, there's General Folks. And General Folks is the man that signed the documents that liberated Holland. So, so it was this really, really cool moment that we were looking at. The pandemic came, we couldn't do it. And the idea was to do it for the 75th anniversary of liberation, right? And we weren't able to do it. And so 2 years go by. We know she's coming. The embassy, working with the embassy, we're able to sort of connect with the palace. The palace is like, yes, she'll do it. We find out that he's got a nephew. We are able to. The nephew was able to fly in and see the princess that liberated her country with our prime minister unveil a plaque. And it was, to me, it was this idea. And I have family members who fought in Holland, like most Canadians, right? Um, and it was this sort of wonderful full story, going from thinking about my grandfather and my great uncle who served in Holland, thinking about having survived the pandemic, having seen this woman come back and forth from the Atlantic, born here, her country not liberated, and then she be able to honor that. And most Canadians don't know about Charles Folks, but if you go to Holland, there's Folks Bridge, there's this, there's that. He's named everything. So the idea of bringing that Canadian memory, I think that would be one of the big ones. The unveiling the French Monument as well, right? It's, I think about the fact that like some of my hair, my half my heritage is French from New France, and we unveiled a French monument. The idea that it went full circle 500 years later from the first time we landed to now, I was able to unveil a monument to the heritage. And then I'm looking at what I'm doing with the Irish Committee, and we're really hoping to identify these famine graves and be able to honor these people. And I think that's at 103, if I can say that I'm this tiny little footnote in Canadian history, or that I was able to do good for an individual person or a community or a group of people, then I'm good. Like, let the rocking chair break from under me.
Yeah, and and then I guess as you're saying those full circle moments, there's a perfect way to kind of end it is now after going through your whole route and kind of hearing about everything you've been able to do and maybe learn as well. If you'd go back to let's say that 16, 17, 18-year-old Nick, about to walk on the U Ottawa campus for the first time, and you'd go back in time and speak with him about, hey, like this is something I've learned throughout my career that I think you should kind of hold on to because I think it's going to pay a lot of dividends for you in the future. What would that one piece of advice be?
Learn who a boss is and learn who a mentor is, and know the difference. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think a lot of, and that sounds a little harsh, but mentors are important, right? I think you can get a lot of information, and mentors may not be people you work with, right? It could be people outside your sphere, but understanding the difference is a big important. And it took me a long time to know the difference between somebody I could trust, somebody who was a mentor, who was looking out for me, making sure, and somebody who was a boss. Some bosses are mentors, some bosses aren't.
Yeah, no, I can absolutely agree with that. Where even when I started a sports market agency a couple of years ago, onto new things now, but I was struggling for a little bit, trying to just, hitting my head against the wall, trying to figure out what to do next. And only when I asked for that help and started having like real mentors where they're kind of sharing all their knowledge and, they wanting you to win and not necessarily get anything in return. And not like they had any part of the company, they were completely doing something else. But they were just sharing all their knowledge. And that's what allowed me to have
Yeah.
leaps and bounds. Right. So I absolutely agree with that. So, yeah, Nick, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Unless there's anything else you'd like
Um,
to share, that's it for
I was
episode
just going to
158.
say, for anybody who's listening, right, I think the goal, don't be afraid to mentor somebody, right? And you might have these small moments that you don't realize are important, but that are. And I think don't be afraid to do that too.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think it pays so much dividends to those people you help out. But yeah, like you said, That's the end for this week's episode. Thank you again, and see everyone
Thanks for
next
having
week.
me.